Hello everybody, and today we'll be taking a look at the 11-year-old 9800 GTX Plus from nvidia. This card released in 2008 for approximately $200, but I picked it up today for only $15 on the used market. When I met with the seller, the first thing he said was that the card was dust-free and runs all games at maximum settings. I knew the latter was a blatant lie, so I assumed the claim of being dust-free was a lie as well. Lo and behold, I step back into my car, and the first thing I see is a giant hunk of dust encasing the heat pipe. Due to this, I found it necessary to give this card a thorough cleaning. While we do that, let's get into the specs and the legacy of this card. The 9800 GTX Plus was revolutionary for its time and changed the future of graphics cards as a whole, leaving a legacy of high performance behind it. One of the great improvements was nvidia finally shrinking the die size down to the 55nm process. The processor for this card was built upon the Tesla architecture and came clocked in at 738 MHz. This card came with 128 CUDA cores, 128 shading units, 64 texture mapping units, 16 RLPs, and supports up to DirectX 10. In addition, our variant was one of the higher end variants, having 1GB of DDR3 VRAM clocked at 1100 MHz on the 256-bit memory bus width. In 2008, this card released around the time frame of the HD Fortnite 50, so competition and comparison between the two were quite common. Overall, people were split between the two. The 4050 was a physically smaller card with a less noisy fan, and also came along with a lower 110-watt TDP, while compared to the 9800 GTX Plus's 142-watt TDP. Along with the drawbacks, the 9800 GTX Plus only performed marginally better, and due to the cheaper price of the HD 4050, AMD's card had a greater appeal for many people. Before we get into the benchmarks today, it needs to be noted that all games are ran in the 1024x768 resolution, unless otherwise specified. Testing today was recorded with OBS on the computer, but we used the CPU as the encoder, as not to cause significant impact upon the results of testing this graphics card. Our test system today has 32GB of DDR3 clocked at 1600 MHz, along with the FX 9590 chip, presenting us without any bottleneck and allowing us to utilize the 9800 GTX Plus to its maximum potential. Regardless, you came here to see if this graphics card could game. So, let's get into some testing and see just how well it performs. First up, we open with a Battle Royale title, Fortnite, in which we tested on both medium and the lowest preset in the 1280x720 resolution. While running the medium preset, the gameplay was horrendous, and along came with some minor input lag. However, when we switched to the lowest preset, the FPS saw an instant boost up to a solid 60 FPS, where it seemed to be capped at, only rarely dropping to the 50s. As you can see in the top left of our screen, GPU usage and CPU usage was locked at 13 and 32%. I cannot tell for sure whether this is a measurement issue on behalf of the FPS software that I use, or if the game was somehow not utilizing the hardware to its maximum potential. Regardless, Fortnite ran well with lowest settings on the 9800 GTX Plus. Following our Battle Royale title, our next benchmark was GTA 5, which released in 2013. The average FPS hung about in the mid to upper 40s with a variety of settings. However, explosions and such lowered the FPS by quite a bit, dipping down into the 30s in some instances of this happening. This game is one that can truly run on most any system, as it only requires fairly minimal system requirements that can be pushed even further by mods and config file editing. Next, we have our first esports title, Rocket League. This game was ran with all settings as high as possible, but without VSync. This combination presented an average FPS that was in the lower 40s and the upper 30s. In addition, gameplay felt fluid and responsive, and playing on these settings was a good fit. This card could probably handle higher resolutions for this game, but some settings would most likely have to be lowered in order to maintain the FPS. Continuing the theme of esports, we have Counter-Strike Global Offensive. Throughout the majority of gameplay, stuttering was not present and the game was fluid and enjoyable to play. We ran CSGO with all settings maxed out without VSync, and even though it achieved a playable FPS in the upper 40s, personally, I'd recommend turning all the settings down to lowest in order to achieve the highest FPS possible, as esports titles are typically best played with a higher FPS. Although CSGO is a bit of a CPU-bound game, the 9800 GTX Plus was still the weakest link throughout our testing of CSGO. After CSGO, we tested Minecraft, which is ran with all fancy settings and such set to maximum, along with the render distance set to 10 chunks. The FPS piddled about in the 130s, and although it isn't very noticeable in the footage, gameplay felt stuttery and laggy in some instances. Reducing chunk rendering helped a bit, but not by much. Though the CPU can still be running at nearly max throughout our benchmarking, it was definitely the GPU causing these issues, as I used to play Minecraft at a much higher FPS with more chunks on this exact computer, except with the GTX 970 instead. Following Minecraft, we have Insurgency, which pleasantly surprised me with an FPS that exceeded my expectations by leaps and bounds. Insurgency came out in 2014. 6 years after the 9800 GTX Plus, but the performance was still extremely playable. The FPS in Insurgency averaged in the lower 80s, which took me by surprise. Due to the hyper-realism of Insurgency, I expected the 9800 GTX Plus to become bogged down and perform badly, especially since the recommended requirements of the game cite the graphics card with 2GB of VRAM. I only did the training in Insurgency, but real matches shouldn't be much more impactful upon the card. Half-Life 2 was released in 2004, and it was the next game tested on our system today. This game displayed the best FPS of any games tested today, averaging in the upper 270s. However, the FPS was maxed out at 300 FPS in most indoor portions of gameplay, while outside gameplay showed more variety in FPS, ranging anywhere from the 250s to the 240s to a maximum of 300 FPS. Next up, we tested Terraria, which ran at a seemingly capped 60 FPS without any stutters or inconsistencies at all. GPU usage never exceeded 17%, so endgame settings and experiences should not be a problem for this card at all. Then again, Terraria can run on most any system, so much so that even Terraria has a mobile game version of itself. Next up, we take a look at the card performance in some indie games, kicking it off by playing some Superflight. The FPS averaged in the mid-40s with all settings set as high as possible. Honestly, I expected better FPS given to the relative simplicity of the game, but considering the age of this card, the FPS wasn't abnormal. Most likely, if you turned all the settings down a bit, you would get a much better FPS. Maintaining the idea of indie games, we have Blood and Bacon with another outstanding experience. This game appeared capped at 60 FPS, only rarely dipping down to 59 FPS. This is another one of those games you can run on basically any computer, and this is a graphics card that can run it well. Our last indie title is Refunk, which is ran with all settings maxed out. In regards to my personal preferences and standards, this game would be considered borderline playable, achieving an average FPS in the lower 30s without stuttering, but with minor fluctuation in the FPS. All settings were maxed out, but lowering settings would definitely yield a higher FPS, a choice I'd be willing to make in this case. For our first unplayable game, we have Just Cause 2. Even though this game came out only 2 years after the 9800 GTX Plus, often running the game for a few minutes ending in it crashing, and sometimes not even wanting to boot up again. All settings were ran maxed out on the system, which may have contributed to this, but changing them did not impact the overall instability of the game. The average FPS was decent, averaging in the mid to upper 20s. For some, this may be playable, but it was not an enjoyable experience by any means, mainly due to the frequent crashing. Next up, we have a somehow even worse experience, in which I have to issue an epilepsy warning here. Here, we have City Skylines, being the other unplayable game on today's list. City Skylines had severe graphical issues, and changing settings only altered the FPS and did not make the flashing go away. With settings on max, the FPS was in the teens, but all settings on lowest yielded an average FPS in the lower 40s. Overall, I was moderately surprised by this card, as it wasn't entirely useless. A good graphics card then, and extremely low-end one now, the 9800 GTX Plus actually held up to some degree throughout the years. I don't expect newer games to be playable, much less runnable, on this graphics card, but you might be able to skirt by with some low-end graphics mods or editing into config files. Also, there were quite a few games that warned me of driver issues before they even launched, even though I was running the latest drivers associated with the card after downloading them for the GeForce experience. OBS, Skyrim, and Refunk were all titles that displayed these errors, but Skyrim was the only one that crashed immediately after launching, even after trying a variety of graphical settings, lowest to highest. Overall, I'd rate this card the same as I did the 4050, a 5 out of 10. As previously stated, it's not completely useless, but shows some capability in gaming tasks. But there are definitely better options within the price range of $15 that could and will outperform this card. Regardless, thank you for watching and I hope you enjoyed the video. Also, please subscribe because that helps a lot in video quality and production and also positively affects my day. Finally, leave any questions or suggestions in the comments below and have a great day. Bye!